A lot has been said about the adventure of Link, so is there really anything left to discover? It turns out there's quite a bit. I wanted to dig deep, so I ventured into the storied halls of Nintendo and discovered their treasure trove of secret information. Okay, that's not true. But after studying interviews, articles, books, and magazines, testing theories and reproducing glitches, I've compiled all my discoveries here. In this episode of Declassified, I'll break down all the secrets, codes, and forgotten lore for this classic game, detailing information you may have heard, some you've forgotten, and some you've never known. It's often noted that the original Zelda team wasn't brought back for the sequel, but this shouldn't be surprising because it wasn't originally a Zelda game at all. Initially, Shigeru Miyamoto wanted to create a side-scrolling action platformer with up and down directional strikes as well as high and low combat mechanics. For the project, a young and fairly inexperienced team was assembled. It was co-directed by Yasuhisa Yamamura, who had only done some minor work on soccer, and Tadashi Sugiyama, who at that point had only done graphic design for Baseball and Ice Climber, and overall game design for Clu Clu Land. For the design, they tapped a young Kazunobu Shimizu. Of course, he would go on to direct several racing projects including F-Zero, but at this point, this was his first major project. The team clearly drew inspiration from other games of the time. Namco's Dragon Buster had an overworld with buildings, winding roads, interactive obstructions, side-scrolling combat stages, and most notably, a down-thrust attack. Falcom's Romancia, or Dragon Slayer Jr., inspired certain location designs and presentations. Meanwhile, the influence of Dragon Quest can't be understated, with ideas such as random enemy encounters, experience, leveling, magic points, environmental overworld tiles, and towns with non-player characters all being implemented. Many design choices were made to circumvent hardware limitations. Since the overworld was fairly small with restrictively narrow paths, visual random monster encounters were used to add a luck factor that made the world feel more complicated. The level-up system added purpose to those repetitive encounters and extended the playtime. At one point, they considered allowing each stat to have 16 levels, but they settled for 8. As the project took shape, various design choices and items were applied, and according to Sugiyama, it became more like a Zelda Gaiden or spin-off. Like the rest of the team, composer Akito Nakatsuka was relatively new, having previously composed only for Devil World, Clu Clu Land, Excitebike, and Ice Climber. His score was both memorable and original, borrowing only the opening phrase from Zelda 1's overworld theme. The title The Adventure of Link was just a way to describe the contents of the game and was accepted without objection. About this time, Miyamoto was making notes for the next official Zelda game, which would eventually become A Link to the Past. He envisioned a party system that included a fighter elf, a magic user, and a fairy-like girl who could scout ahead. Though it never materialized, this idea was the genesis of the fairy spell.
なんかいろいろ文句を言ってると顔は笑ってるっていう風な状態だったんですよ。で、これは売れるよって言って一緒にやってるデザイナーに。ただね、これがね、桁が違うんですよ。
It wasn't until the end of development that Zelda 1 designer and writer Takashi Tezuka finalized the story, linking the otherwise disparate games. They decided to make it a full sequel, attaching a 2 to the title. On January 14, 1987, Zelda no Densetsu 2 Link no Buken was released for the Famicom Disk System. Nearly 2 years before its North American release, and even more shocking, a full 7 months before the original game came out in the West. The 23-month gap between regional releases was due in large part to the infamous chip shortage mentioned in Nintendo Fun Club News. By 1987, Nintendo's popularity had outpaced their projections, and they couldn't produce enough ROM chips to meet demand. The marketing timeline reveals that it wasn't just a delay, but a series of delays. Maps and strategies had already been detailed in the official Nintendo Player's Guide, which came out in 1987. That fall, Fun Club News ran a preview in issue 3, then again in issue 4, and yet again in issue 5. In April of '88, issue 6 featured it on the cover and gave it much deeper coverage. Release seemed imminent, but it wasn't. It was mentioned yet again in the premiere issue of Nintendo Power, where it was announced for October, but that didn't happen either. Even when it was finally established that it would come out in December, Nintendo was clear that there would be very limited quantities. Finally, in December of 1988, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link arrived in North America.
The Legend of Zelda continues. Defeat your enemies, save the kingdom.
Beware.
Some will help you, others will betray
I can
you.
restore life. I can give magic. I can.
I cannot help you.
Zelda!
Use your sword.
Find the crystals.
Rescue the princess.
Zelda! Zelda!
Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power.
With the conversion from disc to cartridge and a nearly 2-year delay, the team made a surprising number of changes. Palaces, which were originally only gray or green, were revised with distinctive color schemes, brick designs, and variations in column capitals. Palace Guardians were also upgraded. The Wizard Carrack was redesigned to face Link and given a subtle casting animation. The fifth palace originally had rematches with Mazura and Germa Fencer, but to add variety they were dropped and replaced with a new character called Guma. And Barba's lifeless sprite with an Eastern dragon design was revamped with a moving, segmented body, an animated mouth, and a more Western appearance. In the overworld, encounter sprites were changed from colorful blobby apparitions to shadowy bots, moblins, and fairies. Without the Disk System's VRAM capabilities, overworld water and lava animations had to be removed. King's Tomb now featured a lighter sky, and the enemies were swapped out for an informative old woman.
This is King's Tomb.
Towns came alive with animated magicians, redesigned river guards and swordsmen, and the addition of 3 new character models. Meanwhile, Link was given a mouth and a more determined rafting sprite. There was originally a misspelled spell, so the reflex spell was respelled reflect. And in Nintendo's effort to avoid religious controversy, the goddess statue was changed to a trophy, the holy water became the water of life, and the river devil, which initially looked like Satan, was made into a shadowy arachnid. Originally, all items were acquired by stabbing them, but this was altered so that Link would hold certain items in the air while fanfare played. Most famously, this changed the feel of cutting the ropes to free the child into this. Other minor gameplay alterations include speeding up elevators and making some creatures impervious to anything but the fire spell. On the disc version, saves would only track the level of the lowest skill. Upon resuming a game, that value would be applied to all 3 skill stats, often causing progress to be lost. But on the bright side, the cost of each level was significantly lower. Attack level 8, for example, cost 4,000 points on the Disk System, but a whopping 8,000 on the NES. If you tally the total experience required to max out all stats, the NES version requires an additional 13,000 points. As is the case with all Disk System conversions, the loss of the extra sound channel resulted in some interesting audio differences. The title theme went from this to this. The boss theme was originally very repetitive. But for the NES, some variation was added. And the battle theme went from this to something completely new. some of the sound effects also saw significant changes. Originally, certain Guardians let out this roar, but the sound wasn't possible on the NES, so it was removed. A change which resulted in a very different game over sequence, with a very familiar laugh. Many years later, Miyamoto deemed the game a failure, saying his games usually improve as they progress from concept to completion, but that Zelda 2 went exactly as planned on paper. He felt limited by the hardware, wishing there had been bigger enemy sprites and shorter load times. Nevertheless, with 4.38 million copies sold, The Adventure of Link became the 8th best-selling game on the system and directly influenced some of the most memorable games ever made. The story artwork in the manual was created much like animation cells, with line work, coloring notes, and characters drawn independently of their backgrounds. The story itself, however, with a murky timeline of events and several ambiguously motivated characters, is a bit convoluted. Still, it contains interesting and sometimes grim details. The key to Ganon's return is the blood of Link. Ganon will be revived by sacrificing Link and sprinkling his blood on the ashes of Ganon. The similarity to 1966's Dracula, Prince of Darkness is hard to ignore. It's also hard to imagine that happening to Link. Ganon's forces trying to kill Link is understandable, but did you know that according to the manual, the Guardians trying to kill him were made by the King of Hyrule? As a side note, the word translated Guardians was softened and should have been guardian deities, and their palaces should have been temples. It's interesting that Zelda 2 borrowed the sleeping princess motif. This classic story has been told and retold for nearly 7 centuries, tracing as far back as Pierce Forest, written in the early 1300s. Of course, this Zelda is not the same Zelda from the first game. After the sleeping spell was cast on her, her grief-stricken brother, the prince, ordered that every female child born into the royal household shall be given the name Zelda. And the Japanese manual clarifies that this is the first Zelda. But since there's no indication how long she's been sleeping, we have no idea how many Zeldas there have been.
Really?
We do know, however, that the story occurred as Link approached his 16th birthday, so he's only 15. And since this is so soon after the events of the first game, when the sleeping Zelda awakens, there will be at least 2 simultaneous Princess Zeldas. And did you know that even though this story is literally The Legend of Zelda, Zelda 2 is the only game in the series that doesn't use the phrase in its title. This is even stranger considering the Japanese version does. It's also the only Zelda game to not include rupees and to include character lives and 1-ups. And though Link is known for not speaking, Zelda 2 is one of the rare games where he does. Interestingly, the overworld contains a miniature map of the first game, and everything's there. Eastern beaches, the desert, waterways, the lost woods, Death Mountain, a graveyard, and even Spectacle Rock. Most of the town names were used in Ocarina of Time. Mido became the mischievous character in Kokiri Forest, and Rauru, Ruto, Saria, Naboru, and Darunia were used for 5 of the sages. Rauru was used again in Tears of the Kingdom as the founding king of Hyrule.
My name is Rauru.
As far as the timeline is concerned, however, the founding came first, then the sages, and the towns were named after them. Because even though it's the second game in the series, Zelda 2 is actually the final game in the Hero's Downfall branch of the timeline. Did you know that according to a 2001 Zelda timeline, the events of Link's Awakening occurred during this crossing? This was originally posted by Nintendo of America's Dan Osen, but was taken down a year later and retconned. Everyone knows about Error, but did you know his name was intentionally referencing the tech term error? Even more interesting, his doppelganger in the woods, Bagu, was supposed to be named Bug, but the translation was botched, and ironically, it was an error that ruined the pun. The Adventure of Link rode the same wave of popularity as Super Mario Bros. 2, leading to a high point for Zelda merchandise. There were lunchboxes, folders, cereal, activity books, a Japan-only interactive game book, stickers, sticker cards, Valentine cards, figurines, and who can forget the animated series which aired every Friday as part of the Super Mario Bros. Super Show. While the cartoon used music and sound effects from Zelda 1, the loose love story, character design, use of magic, and featured enemies derived mostly from Zelda 2. But interestingly, the Zelda 2 connections in Captain N were even more obvious. In fact, the episode Quest for the Potion of Power is a complete self-contained reimagining of the game, with a potion to revive Ganon, Rauru Town, a woman who says,
Please, I know nothing.
Parappa Palace, elevators, Horsehead, Moa in the graveyard, Link falling in a secret graveyard tunnel that leads to the island palace, a bottle of magic, Iron Knuckle statues, Rebanak, Reflect Magic, and even a kiss from Zelda at the end. Did you know there were 45 unique enemies in the game? Some returned from the original game.
Good times.
These lizard dogs, for example, weren't named in early sources, but clues to their identity were there. Often river-dwelling, fireball-spitting, and fin-headed. Believe it or not, they're Zora. Other enemies looked and behaved like original enemies, but for some reason were given completely new names. One would think these enemies, which disappear, reappear, shoot magic, and wear robes, would be Wizrobes. But they're not. They're wizards. And if you ever thought the caped sword-bearing Iron Knuckle was related to Zelda 1's Dark Nut, you were right. In Japan, Dark Nuts are called Tartnaku, Iron Knuckles are called Einnaku, and the horse-mounted boss Rebanak is called Rebanaku. When writing Japanese sounds with the Latin alphabet, there are a few letters that have historically caused confusion. One sound could be transliterated as an R or L, often followed by a U, and another could be a B or V. This makes transliteration of this guardian particularly interesting. When it was originally transliterated, it was given B's and an R and simplified to Barba, but when the spelling is adjusted with V's and an L, his identity becomes clear. When you adjust the R and B in Rebanak, it becomes Levonak, an iron knuckle riding a levitating horse. And the Geld in Geldarm could have just as easily been written with an RU as Gerudo. Suddenly, the sandy desert connection between the Gerudo, the Geru, and Geldarm sandworms becomes obvious. Perhaps the most interesting bits of lore concern the Guardians. Elements of Germafencer and Rebanak derive from the headless riders of Western folklore, particularly the Dullahan of Ireland, who are often depicted in Japanese culture wearing full armor. Mazura was inspired by Mezu, the horse-headed demon who in Chinese mythology guards the underworld of hell alongside the ox-headed Gozu. So it's not surprising there's an ox-headed enemy too, not Gozu, but Guma. That said, there's an interesting connection regarding the name Guma and these three enemies. In Japan, these are called Guma. These are called Hell Guma, and when the game was converted to cartridge, they added this enemy as a new guardian. When the localization team received production art, they mistakenly thought this ox-headed image labeled Guma belonged to the new boss, so they called him Guma instead. Meanwhile, the Hell Guma was localized as a Doom Knocker, and the now name-stricken original Guma was never officially named. However, in keeping with the original connection between the characters, he's often called Doom Rattle. Did you know a version of the game was being developed for the Super Nintendo? Apparently Yoshiaki Koizumi and Miyamoto were experimenting with a thin polygon Link as seen from the side. Unfortunately, it wouldn't have been completed until after the launch of the Nintendo 64, and they needed to divert talent to work on Star Fox 64, so the project was cancelled. The only controller-based code is the quick save. Pausing the game and then pressing up and A on controller 2 will take you to the end screen where you can either continue or save. This is particularly useful for speedrunning or when Link is trapped in a glitch. Did you know item drops aren't random? There are 3 subgroups of enemies: those that never drop items, small enemies, and large enemies. Every 6th small enemy will drop a blue jar 7/8 of the time and a 50-point treasure bag 1/8 of the time. And every 6th large enemy will drop either a red jar or a 200-point treasure bag half the time. It's no secret that the old woman in town refills your entire magic meter. But did you know that if you cast life before it fills completely, it will continue to fill to maximum? In fact, you can cast it multiple times, allowing you to fill up both magic and life meters, as long as you return to the spell menu between each cast. And do you know what else?
Please, I know nothing.
The fairy spell not only allows you to evade hazards, but to fly right through locked doors and even collect special items. There are several unused graphics hiding in the code. 3 additional side-scrolling locations are there, as well as distressed wall tiles, palace-specific spike sprites, and even window designs for the maze and hidden palaces were coded, but none of them were implemented. Did you know bubbles could be killed? They give you 50 experience points, which makes them valuable early in the game, but at sword level 1, it takes a whopping 126 hits to kill one. Everyone knows that stabbing enemies mid-jump almost guarantees a hit, but there are a couple lesser-known techniques as well. Did you know that every time you press down while down thrusting registers as a distinct attack? The technique, known as jackhammering, completely annihilates many enemies. Similarly, every directional change during a mid-air sword strike counts as a separate attack. If done fast enough, the whirlwind technique can register multiple hits. But the easiest and most powerful technique in the game is apparently crouching. Because Carrot can be defeated by crouching and casting Reflect, and Link's Shadow can be defeated by crouching in the corner and stabbing. Did you know that if you enter a forced battle tile as a random monster touches you, the monster encounter will replace it? This can be quite helpful since monster encounters are usually much easier. Zelda 2 contains a few pretty confusing mazes, but thankfully there are secrets to navigating them. The route through Death Mountain is easy. Always choose the cave on the right, and never take an elevator. And the path through the labyrinthine Great Palace is as simple as left, right, right, left. There are only 4 elevator shafts with a solid floor and a choice to go left or right. As you encounter them, just remember to go left, right, right, left, in that order. And if you lose all your lives here, don't worry. Getting a game over anywhere else in the game sends you back to North Castle, but if you lose your lives in the Great Palace, you'll restart at the entrance. In fact, a quick save continue will start you there as well. Did you know The Adventure of Link was one of the earliest games to include the New Game Plus concept? After completing the game, a Triforce will appear beside Link on the save file, and you'll start with all magic spells, sword techniques, and stat levels. Perhaps the biggest secret of all stems from the fact that the 6 palaces don't need to be fully completed to advance. By grabbing the dungeon treasures and leaving, you can explore ever deeper into Hyrule and acquire all the spells and items in the game. Once you find the magic key from Hidden Kasuto, you can return to each palace powered up and unrestricted by locked doors, allowing you to skip any further key hunting portions of the game and easily defeat the 6 palace guardians. But there's an even bigger reason to do this.
Wow!
When you place a crystal at the end of a level, your experience fills completely, boosting you to the next stat upgrade. Of the 43,100 total experience points needed to max out all stats, 29,000 of them are from those final 6 upgrades. By getting these boosts at the end of the game, you'll save a ton of time grinding. There are quite a few glitches in The Adventure of Link. Some can be useful, but most are just oddities that are fun to try. The acceleration glitch is hard to control, but super fun. To do it, left and right need to be pressed at the same time. This isn't even possible with an NES controller, but can easily be done with a modified controller or keyboard in emulation. By pressing both and tapping or releasing one, Link will blast across the screen, shoot through locked doors, moonwalk, or even glitch locations to appear like somewhere else in Hyrule. The fairy feet glitch, which interestingly was discovered when a player named Saver was playing with his feet, allows you to bypass many forced encounter sequences. To execute the maneuver, cast Fairy and frame tap just until the fairy is no longer visible. Then move in the opposite direction. If done correctly, when you leave the area, you'll skip the entire thing. This can also be done with Link alone, but requires nearly inhuman precision and multiple frame-perfect inputs. Only a handful of top-tier speedrunners have perfected the move, but it is possible. If you cast a spell and then talk to a villager and close the dialog box before the spell animation ends, it'll freeze the palette on one of the flashing colors. It's useless, but fun. Did you know there's a way to start a new game with multiple stat boosts? While playing another file, place a crystal in a palace statue. As the experience is ticking up, pause the game and press up and A on controller 2 to save. Create a new file, and as soon as you begin, the remaining experience from the original file will continue to fill in this one, giving this new Link many level ups. Perhaps the most famous glitch, the Fairy Warp glitch, has been known since the early days of Nintendo Power. If you cast Fairy while above the HUD and then try to move, you'll fall into another location in the game. Warping from atop falling block rooms in Palaces 2, 3, and 5 will send you above the palace entrance, but warping again from up there can have a variety of effects, depending on where you're standing when you do it. Much of the time you'll just get trapped in the floor, but if you position Link in the right place, you'll be sent to an alternate first palace. It'll have the layout of Palace 1, but retain the color scheme and textures from the palace where you began, leading to some very interesting events. If you fairy warp in Darunia, you'll fall into what has been lovingly called Glitch Town. Darunia is found pretty late in the game, however, so there aren't many useful applications, and exiting right from here strands you in the ocean. Thankfully, there's a parallel Glitch Town accessible early in the game, and this one is actually useful. To get there, find the healer in Raru Town. Align Link's shield with the door frame and speak with her just as her face touches the window, and then again when her dress is 1 pixel from the door, literally the last frame before she opens the door. If done correctly, she'll climb invisible steps and go in through the bathroom window. Using the healer glitch, the door will transport you to this parallel Glitch Town, which allows for some interesting effects. For one thing, exiting to the right from here teleports you to King's Tomb, allowing you to cross the bridge, completely skip the caves of Death Mountain, and get the hammer early. This opens up many areas of the map where Link isn't yet supposed to go. And back to Glitch Town, if you enter the door, it returns you to Glitch Town, seemingly doing nothing. But in actuality, it shifts Link's position slightly to the left. After the 5th cycle through the door, these compounding leftward shifts put the game into a state called scroll lock. While in this state, rightward scrolling areas are passable but riddled with graphical glitches. Meanwhile, leftward scrolling areas are locked and no longer scroll at all, shortening otherwise lengthy corridors down to a single screen. While confusing to look at, scroll lock saves time, and in some cases allows for some truly bizarre wrong warps. Do you know any interesting bits that I missed? If so, please comment below and I'll add them to a future video. If you like what I'm doing, the highest compliment you can give is recommending the channel to friends and family who might find it interesting. Thank you, and special thanks to the Retro Club patrons of the channel. You make this possible.